Chassidus, its official birthday is the 18th of Elul, which is probably August or September, of 1734. That's the official birth date of Chassidus, the way it's in our tradition, in the Chabad tradition. On that date, the Holy Baal Shem Tov, who was then 36 years old, was his 36th birthday actually, had been a hidden tzaddik and had spent a decade learning Chassidus from Achia Hashilaini, from a soul from another world who had come to teach him Torah, like the Arizal studied Torah from the Eliyahu Hanavi and so forth. As the expression goes in our culture, came out of the closet. The Baal Shem Tov, in quotes, revealed himself. And the history is that the Baal Shem Tov didn't want to do it, and yet we celebrate that date as if it's one of the greatest things that ever happened, notwithstanding the Baal Shem Tov's lack of desire to do it, because the Baal Shem Tov's revealing himself and revealing the philosophy and lifestyle and inspiration of Chassidus is the reason we're here. When Chassidus emerged, they were the new movement, which meant, as per all of Jewish tradition, they could expect to be severely scrutinized, judged, examined with a fine-tooth comb, and mistrusted for a variety of reasons, and on a variety of levels. And that's exactly what happened. The onset, the emergence of the Hasidic movement, especially because it was a populist movement, in other words, it wasn't a movement for elite only. The majority of members of the Hasidic movement were simple people who came to the Holy Baal Shem Tov not because they understood his scholarship and his inspiration, but because he was a nice man. And he made them feel good. And when necessary, performed miracles for them. So any kind of a movement that has such a broad appeal immediately becomes suspect of being a cult, of being a movement that's with a sinister intent about mind control and so forth. And certainly the Baal Shem Tov and his followers suffered these accusations terribly, severely. What's interesting about it is that from what I understand, the Baal Shem Tov himself didn't suffer that much. It was the next generation, and especially the third generation, that it got hotter and hotter and hotter in the kitchen, which doesn't make so much sense. Why would it be that as Hasidus became more and more prominent and effective and took roots, the opposition would grow? And part of the reason is because the competition, the criticism was not entirely ideal, was not entirely based on truth. A lot of the criticism of Hasidus was economic. It was about business, big business, and politics, leadership. And as time went on, the criticism of Hasidus on an idealistic level, on a theological, on a principle level, was less and less. And the criticism of Hasidus more because of economic considerations and political considerations became more and more. And as a result, it became uglier and uglier. Now, what is interesting is that the leaders of the Hasidic movement, beginning with the Baal Shem Tov himself, accepted the fact that the onus was on them. They had to explain themselves. They were the new movement. They were the new kid on the block. They were the ones who needed to do the explaining. That's how they saw themselves. And to this end, a lot of things were done. The Baal Shem Tov traveled. There's some very interesting stories of Baal Shem Tov's travelings. The Maggid didn't travel, but he sent his disciples. And the Alter Rebbe traveled. In fact, we know, as a matter of fact, that on 2 occasions the Alter Rebbe visited Vilna, the stronghold, the metropolis, the center of the opposition to Hasidus. And he tried to meet the Vilna Gaon, who was one of the greatest minds of his time, and who represented the opposition to Hasidus. It's false to say he led the opposition to Hasidus. The opponents of Hasidus used him as a justification, as an excuse, as a sign of credibility, but he was not nearly as involved in opposing Hasidus as people will tell you he was. He sat and learned day and night. That's all he did was study Torah. He did sign, he did agree with the ban, the excommunication ban levied against Hasidim, but he certainly was not proactively involved in fighting with Hasidim. That's not what it wasn't his thing. And the Alter Rebbe tried to meet him. The first time he came to Vilna, he came clandestinely, he came secretly, and he didn't want to meet the Vilna Gaon in person because he felt that the Gra would recognize him. But he corresponded with him. He wrote notes back and forth. And when he left Vilna, the Alter Rebbe's comment was, I didn't realize how great he was until now. Alter Rebbe said, I didn't realize how strong the opposition was. How great a God, a great master of Torah and Kabbalah and so forth that Vilna Gaon was until he actually met him. He understood that he was up against a very, very stiff opposition. He visited Vilna years later a second time. But this was in an official capacity. He was already a Rebbe. And he came without, officially, and there were terms that had been negotiated. The Vilna Gaon knew he was coming and agreed to meet him. And many people say had the Alter Rebbe and the Vilna Gaon met face to face, that would have ended the machlokes. And but it was not to be. The bitter end of the story was that the mean, angry opponents of Hasidus told the Vilna Gaon, you cannot meet the Alter Rebbe because just meeting him is giving him credibility, and you're not allowed to give credibility to a no goodnik. And the Vilna Gaon said, I gave him my word is a word, and I'm going to keep it. So they went to the Vilna Gaon's mother, and they convinced her to insist that out of kibbud of aim, out of respect for her, he should leave town. And he listened to his mother. And he left town. And there's different versions of the story. The Soloveitchiks, who are themselves misnagdim, say that the Vilna Gaon, that their version of the story goes, the Vilna Gaon saw the Alter Rebbe through the peephole in the door, and he says, if I meet this man, he's gonna conquer me. And he climbed out the window and ran away. It's very unfortunate, because had that event taken place, Jewish history may be considerably different. I'm not going to say there would have been fewer tzaras, but perhaps there would be less machlokes. But that's God's wish, and there's very little we can do to help that. What is true, as I started to say, was that the Alter Rebbe and many of his contemporaries felt that they had the obligation to explain themselves. Years and years later, the later Rebbes of Chabad and other Hasidic movements would say in their own defense, we no longer need to defend ourselves. The credibility of Hasidus has been established by its record, by its effect, and by the fact that it's only made Jewish people better and not worse. And for someone to come along, 150 years or 200 years or 250 years after the fact and say, well, who says Hasidus is legitimate Judaism? Hasidus' answer to that is, I'm sorry. You have an itch. You see you have a problem. That's your problem. Hasidus feels that at this point to defend ourselves is not necessary. But at that time, they felt that it was very important to defend themselves. And to this end, the Alter Rebbe traveled quite a bit in his early years. I'm talking about Alter Rebbe was in his 30s and early 40s. Alter Rebbe lived all of 68 years. So in his middle and late 30s, or let's say middle and late 20s and early 30s, he traveled. And he was in the big Misnagdim centers in Shklov and in Minsk and in Pinsk. And there'd be huge debates where he would be up on a stage and people would just ask him questions. And he had to explain himself. At that time, it was a world saturated with Torah in an unimaginable way. The love and the respect for Torah that existed in Lita is literally indescribable. And the number of people who stood on the highest levels of Torah comprehension is also innumerable. Probably thousands of rabbis who did nothing but learn. They held no position, they gave no classes, who were just so full of Torah, it's incredible. And they would meet the Alter Rebbe. And so much of these debates was not actually discussing Chassidus, but simply testing the Alter Rebbe's scholarship. Because in that world, if you were not a scholar, you were a nobody. And the Alter Rebbe showed them his scholarship. And this, even if it did not make them into Hasidim or take away their opposition, it certainly took the bitterness, the anger out of the opposition. It became more principled. And a lot of people, or a significant number of people, actually became Hasidim because of these trips and journeys. And the Alter Rebbe would have various debates, discussions that were usually negotiated ahead of time. In other words, they were done in an honorable and respectful way, and it led to softening the bitter division that happened in Hasidim and Misnagdim. You all know that the end of the story was Alter Rebbe was actually put in jail. His life was in danger. And to the Vilna Gaon's credit, it happened after he passed away. And many people say, and I think that there's credibility to it, had he been alive, it would not have occurred. Because the machlokes took a turn for the worse. It became very vicious, very political, very, very unprincipled. But in a relatively short time, after the Alter Rebbe was arrested and liberated, the machlokes ended. There are notes, documents, written as early as 1806, 1807, where the greatest leaders of the Misnagdim collaborated with Hasidim of the Alter Rebbe. I saw a published note signed by Rabbi Chaim Volozhin. Chaim Volozhin was the greatest of the Talmidim of the Vilna Gaon, bar none. And the Pinchas Reizes, who was a chassid of the Alter Rebbe's, that jointly were raising money for a cause and helping Jews. And it just shows how early on, this is 1806, 3 years after the Alter Rebbe passed away, that the winds of war had subsided. Politicians can politic forever, In terms of Hasidus, after the Alter Rebbe's generation, certainly the war subsided significantly, and within 25 years, Hasidim and Misnagdim were literally friends, because they found, unfortunately, a real opposition, a real opponent, and that was the Haskalah, the Reform that finally made inroads into Eastern Europe, and that had to be dealt with, and the best way to do it was to join forces. And during times that at Tzemach Tzedek, Hasidim and Misnagdim worked together in every committee as friends in all of these very, very serious social and political and religious matters. But going back to the times of the Alter Rebbe, it was one of the things the Alter Rebbe felt obligated to do was to explain himself and to defend himself. And he also, as we've read in a number of other letters, felt that it was incredibly important for Hasidim to behave. For Hasidim to understand that their actions would reflect not only on them, but on the movement, and then their leaders. And one foolish action by the part of a foolish, overzealous, or disrespectful chassid can cause indescribable, irreparable harm to the Hasidic movement, as in fact occurred. I've told you the stories before. One chassid did something that was disrespectful, and the whole movement would suffer because of it. Now, the letter we're going to learn tonight is a written example of the same. The Alter Rebbe is defending Chassidus. That's what this letter is. There was a criticism levied against the Baal Shem Tov's writings, and I intend to explain it to you. And the Alter Rebbe felt obligated to defend the Baal Shem Tov. At that time, Chassidus was new. The Baal Shem Tov's writings were and continue to be most vague, very, very abstract. And the Alter Rebbe said, I have an obligation to explain the Baal Shem Tov's teachings. Now, what emerges from this letter, and the Alter Rebbe is explaining the Baal Shem Tov's teachings, is not anything that is going to take away the Misnagdim's objection. It's not, in other words, after you read this letter, the Misnagdim is still going to say, the Nanchos, the opposition is going to say, well, after 8 pages of writings, you have simply crystallized what we disagree about. But the Alter Rebbe, by elaborating and developing this idea, is first of all explaining that what the Baal Shem Tov is saying isn't simplistic and childish, but very, very profound and very mystical and very philosophical. And one other thing, he shifts the criticism away from Hasidus to the Arizal, to the Arizal, to the great Ari, who was a great Kabbalist, who was beyond objection. The Misnagdim studied the teachings of the Arizal just like Hasidim did. And the Alter Rebbe says, the issue that you have is not with us. The criticism that you have, the opposition that you have is not with us, it's with the Arizal. And you believe in the teachings of the Arizal. So take a look in the mirror. That's in effect what happens in this letter. But it's significant to appreciate this point, that the Alter Rebbe here spends it's a very, very long letter. I'm not going to say it's the longest letter in the Tanya, but it's quite long. It's very, very long. Defending the Baal Shem Tov. And he says, I feel obligated to do it. This was part of his responsibility. And again, I'm explaining this to you on my own basis, because Hasidus was new. And what emerges from this lengthy discussion is not to silence the Misnagdim, but really to crystallize what separates Hasidim from Misnagdim, and to tell the Misnagdim, your criticism really shouldn't be levied at us. It should be levied at the Arizal. And as you'll see over the course of the next couple of weeks, as we'd explore this lengthy letter, is that the issues that separate Hasidim from the Misnagdim, theologically, I'm not talking about politics and economics and social issues, I mean principal issues, theologically, were very core beliefs. In other words, each camp accused the others of having such beliefs that would be beyond the pale of Judaism. They weren't arguing about Jewish customs or something trivial. They were arguing about what they believed about God and God's involvement in His world and God's relationship to evil. That each camp accused the other of being completely outside the pale of Judaism. So it's very polar. It's very, very extreme. And again, in Mitzvah Hashem, with the help and grace of God, we will develop this over the course of the next few weeks. Now, the Baal Shem Tov wrote nothing. The famous joke, the famous comment that's often made is, a young Litvish boy asks his father, was the Baal Shem Tov a great man? And he says, I have no idea, he didn't publish anything. Baal Shem didn't write any books. And of course, the Hasidic answer to that, we are the Baal Shem Tov's books. That's Sefer Tel Sodom. Every human being, every Chassid, every person of the Shaykhs to Yiddishkeit today, that's an Ashkenazic Jew, can thank the Baal Shem Tov for it. So we are his books, which is a far more meaningful book than a published work. But the Baal Shem Tov did not publish his own writings, his own teachings. In fact, we have one known document in the Baal Shem Tov's own hand, where he wrote a letter. The Baal Shem Tov spoke, and his disciples recorded. And a lot of what his disciples recorded has reached us in various different venues. The very first work of Hasidus was written by the Told of Yaakov Yosef, who was the oldest of the Baal Shem Tov's disciples, and he frequently says, Shamaiti mi moiri, I heard from my holy master, from holy Baal Shem Tov. The Degel Machane Ephraim, the Sidlik of a Rebbe, he was a grandson of the Baal Shem Tov's. The older brother of the Baruch of Mezhebush, frequently, he has a Sefer of Hasidus, which is published, one of the oldest Hasidic works. I think it also was published before the Tanya. Frequently makes reference to his teachers, to his grandfather's teachings, to the Baal Shem Tov's teaching. And there are others also who quote the Baal Shem Tov. And there was a Jew, whose name I don't remember at the moment, who compiled, who collected teachings from the Baal Shem Tov. Some of them, I think, came from already published works, but many of them he collected from the disciples. In other words, he went around to the Baal Shem Tov disciples and gathered manuscripts. And he published 2 volumes of the teachings of the Baal Shem Tov. One is called Keser Shem Tov, the crown of Shem Tov, which is teachings of Baal Shem Tov on the Pashas and on Tanakh and on other things. And the other is called Tzavos HaRivosh. Tzavos means the will, the final will and testament of Rivosh. Rivosh is Rebbe Yisrael Baal Shem Tov. Now, Tzavos HaRivosh is not a tzavos. It's not a will at all. It's just a collection of thoughts that I suppose you could call more practical, more avodah-based, more teaching you how to think and feel as a Jew than teaching you ideas of Hasidus. And these 2 books were published, if I'm not wrong, around the time that the Tanya was published, maybe a little bit later, a few years later. Within a decade of the publishing of the Tanya, these books were published. This same rabbi then also published teachings from the Baal Shem Tov's disciple, the Holy Maggid of Arz Yankev and Likutei Amorim. So those are the earliest teachings we have from the Baal Shem Tov. Now, there are a couple of things you need to understand. First of all, the Baal Shem Tov didn't write these things down, they were written by his disciples. Second of all, they were probably copied. So by the time they got the print, it's conceivable that errors entered into the text. Moreover, the Baal Shem Tov spoke in Yiddish, and the teachings are written in Hebrew. So there is an inevitable measure of inexactness, or inexactitude. And in this particular case, a non-Chassid, I don't know who he was, and I don't know where he stood in terms of his politics and his economics and his social standing. In other words, was he an idealist who was criticizing Hasidus on principle alone, or did he have other considerations? I don't know. But he wrote a letter, perhaps he publicized it also, criticizing the teachings of the Baal Shem Tov and singling out one particular passage, which is printed, it's 4 lines, tiny little teaching. And when you read it, you don't really get its depth. And he argued how in this teaching, the Baal Shem Tov is speaking heresy. In other words, he wasn't simply saying, look at this, a 4-line teaching has no meaning, it has no substance, it has no depth. he was saying, sure, he's saying something, and what he's saying goes against the core beliefs of Judaism. And the Alter Rebbe needed to respond. And he does. The response includes, first of all, making the observation that this book that this person quotes was not the will of the Baal Shem Tov, nor was it written by the Baal Shem Tov, written by the Baal Shem Tov's disciples. Moreover, since the Baal Shem Tov spoke in Yiddish, this is in Hebrew, there's a possibility for a degree of inexactness. And then he addresses what this person criticizes and responds. And like I explained to you before, he finishes the letter by saying, you should really direct your critique to the Arizal, not to us, because your objection is not to our teachings, but to the anchoring of our teachings in the Baal Shem Tov Arizal. In other words, you're calling us heretics is in effect calling a person who you value and consider and respect one of the greatest Kabbalists who ever lived of being heretic, the Arizal. And that's the, so to speak, the direction of this letter. At the conclusion of this letter, the Baal Shem Tov Alter Rebbe says this. You see, I've done a good job. He took a 4-line teaching and makes it into an 8-page essay. And he says, I've demonstrated to you that the teachings of the Baal Shem Tov, which appear to be simplistic and shallow, are incredibly profound and incredibly scholarly with an incredible amount of depth. And first of all, I've demonstrated its wisdom and depth. Moreover, I've expressed, I've opened up, I've made clear what it is that we disagree about and where the criticism should be directed. And then he says, you probably have hundreds of criticisms against every one of those teachings. He says, you can't expect me to write a response to each one. I'll be busy for the rest of my life. If you have an interest, send somebody to me and I'll talk to him. But don't send anybody. Send someone deep, wise, understanding, tuned in, which will allow for me to reveal to him the depth and the profundity of the teachings of the Baal Shem Tov in a way that will be achieved within a reasonable amount of time. And that's how the letter finishes. What is the letter about? Now that I gave you the introduction, what is the letter about? The letter is about the issue of anger, which I guess some people know some people who deal with. Of course, nobody in this room deals with anger, because we're all such perfect specimen. Anger. And it begins with a quote. Anybody who becomes angry as though they are idolatrous. Anger is like avodah zarah. Now this happens to be a quote that's not written in the Gemara, even though it's quoted as a Gemara. There are similar quotes in the Gemara. This exact quote is not in the Gemara. The exact quote is in the Zohar. And this is one of those most interesting of things, because the Rambam quotes it. The Rambam quotes this phrase directly, now, supposedly the Rambam never saw the Zohar. And yet, he gives a direct quote from the Zohar in a case where this quote does not exist in the literature that supposedly the Rambam had his hands on. So you figure out where the Rambam got this quote from. Because in the Talmud it doesn't exist. The Zohar Rambam supposedly didn't see, and yet he says, Omru Razal, Kalakayas, Chila, our rabbis teach us that anybody who gets angry, as though he were idolatrous, an idol worshipper. And of course the question becomes why? Why is anger so bad as to be tantamount to idolatry, to idol worship? Now I'll get back to that. But before I explore that, in other words, why anger is equivalent to tantamount to idolatry, let me first say this. Rambam, and by no means this is the only one, has something called Hilchot Deis, Hilchot Deot, laws that address questions of ethics. The very beginning of Laws of Deis, the first 3 chapters, if you will, talk about midas, character traits, personality, nature. And the Rambam talks about the idea that some people have one set of character traits, other people have another set of character traits, and all of us are a mixed bag. Every person has good and bad in their mix, so to speak. And he explores the question of the refinement of character, of people dealing with the ugly parts of themselves and refining themselves. And he establishes as a constant, as a rule, as a law, what they call the golden rule, which is to stay in the center. to be neither pole. Don't be incredibly generous, don't be incredibly cheap. Don't be incredibly happy, don't be incredibly sad. And on. With several exceptions. And one of those exceptions is anger. Rambam says when it comes to anger, you need to take an extreme. Ad kaseh ha'achid. Never get angry. And there are a couple, I think, Gaiva also. Arrogance is another attribute that Rambam says you shouldn't be in the middle, you should be to an extreme. But anger, he clearly says, when it comes to anger, anger is bad, period. The smallest amount of anger is bad too, period. You know, there's an ancient expression that says something to the effect, anger is like burning yourself up, creating a fire inside yourself and hoping the other guy gets burnt. Anger is so self-destructive and such a waste of energy. And because of this, the Rambam talks about dealing with anger. He doesn't give you a long speech. In general, Rambam doesn't give long speeches. And what he says, he gives you a model, he gives you a form of dealing with anger, what that you and I would call behavior modification, exercises. If you have an anger issue, force yourself to be in situations that you are prone to blow up, to get angry, and suppress the emotion. And he takes the position that if people exercise their restraint, if people put themselves in situations where they are forced to suppress that anger, they will master their anger. And of course, the first step in mastering anger is not expressing it. The second step in mastering anger is not feeling it. And Rambam doesn't talk so much about not feeling anger as much as he addresses not expressing the anger. In later works of Jewish ethics, Musar, they delve into it more thoroughly. Books like the Mesilas Yesharim, the guide to the path of the righteous, and other books like these deal with anger in a more philosophical way, where they won't simply say, don't get angry and here are the exercises, but they'll actually explore why. What is wrong with anger? And they'll talk about how destructive an emotion it is, and how counterproductive it is, how it makes divisions between people, and so forth and so on. If one were to do a comprehensive thesis on anger, you'd have to read many, many books on Musar from the Rishonim, from the Rechaim, from the earlier rabbis, later rabbis, which would certainly give you much material. Some would be more practical, like the Rambam, dealing with it from a perspective of behavioral modification. Others would be more philosophical. But of course, the point of philosophy is to contemplate how bad anger is, and therefore to hopefully intellectually redirect your energy away from anger. But Kabbalah and Hasidus link anger to a lack of faith and offer a theological resolution to the anger issue. Not a behavior modification resolution to anger, not a philosophical resolution to anger, but a theological resolution to anger. Why are you angry, and why is anger wrong? And at the core of it is this pisgam. Anger is like idol worship. Why? Because why do you get angry? Because stuff happens. And usually you don't get angry at your cat. You get angry at another human being. In other words, stuff happens and somebody can be blamed for it. One of the most frustrating situations you can get yourself into when something terrible happens and you can't get upset about anybody, If at least I can have an enemy, that'll be worthwhile. But something happened, and it happened randomly. It happened without a distinct and identifiable human hand, so I can't even be upset about it, which is even more upsetting. But anger is usually directed at a person. And the argument, in short, is everything that happens is by the divine hand. Even when people exercise choice. Somebody dissed you, as they say in the 90s. So that's a free will on their part. As far as you are concerned, it's hashgacha pratis. It's a divine... God wanted this to happen to you. That they made a bad choice is their business. That they have to give a reckoning is their issue. That they're going to be punished for it is their situation. But from your perspective, that person's free will is, in as much as you are concerned, the divine hand. And not seeing it that way is a lack of faith. And that's the meaning of the Maimon Chazal, why is anger tantamount to idolatry? Because idolatry, people in ignorance presume idolatry to be simplistic and shallow and superstitious and nuts. But idolatry is a theology. It's a philosophy of theos, of what's happening in the relationship between heaven and earth. And idolaters don't say there isn't a God. Idolaters say God's not very involved. He's involved indirectly, he's got a bunch of helpers, he's on vacation, he's not paying attention. And that's what anger is symptomatic of. My anger at that person is not saying there's no God. My anger at that person is saying God's not that deeply involved in the world. And because he's not that deeply involved in the world, much of what occurs is not directly from him, so I can afford, or I can indulge in the luxury of being angry at so-and-so because of whatever it is that he did that I don't like. When in reality, everything is by hashgacha pratis, everything is by divine hand, even issues that involve a person's free will. And that's the essence of the interpretation of this Maim Chazal. This is really what the Baal Shem Tov says. When somebody disses you and you're angry, direct it at God because it comes from God. Directing it at somebody else is a lack of faith. Yeah, but man has free will. This individual has exercised choice, bad judgment. So as far as that person is concerned, the Alter Rebbe says, Ala nidun kvar, he will have to give a reckoning for his poor choice. But as far as you are concerned, Ala nidun kvar nigzim rashmayim, if it happened to you, God wanted it to happen to you. And if that person exercised bad choice and brought this ill effect upon you, God would have found another way to bring it to you. In other words, as far as you are concerned, it came from God. And he brings a story in Tanakh, which is really quite compelling. It really is quite compelling. And of course, the different commentaries on the Navi offer different commentaries, but this is an explicit pasuk. There was a fellow by the name of Shimi ben Gera, a rabbi. So great a rabbi that the greatest scholars of his time, including King David and King Solomon themselves, were intimidated by his scholarship. And he would often mock King David's level of learning, and King David had a son who would defend him, and so forth. He was an incredible, great Talmud Chacham. At the very end of David HaMelech's life, when he was 67 years old, there was a terrible, terrible civil war and uprising led by his own son Avshalom. David HaMelech was afraid for his life, so he ran away from Jerusalem. As he was leaving, he met this Shimi ben Gera, this scholar. Now, of course, in times of revolution, it's very, very difficult to stay on the fence. You feel like you've got to join a camp. And Shimi ben Gera hedged his bets. Shimi ben Gera saw that in all likelihood, King David would be assassinated and his son would succeed him. So he joined that camp. And coincidentally, he meets David as he's running from Jerusalem. So he washes the floor with him. He absolutely curses him out. He curses out King David in the most vicious and severe and personal way. Now, Jewish law says that a king is not allowed to forgive. If you diss a king, he's got to take revenge. And what happens? Shimi ben Gera gambled and he lost. Avshalom was killed, and King David returns to Jerusalem. Who's the first person to come out to greet him and make his friendship again? The same Shimi ben Gera. And he knows that he's done something unforgivable, and he greets King David, who is of course in a very, very favorable mood. He's just been saved from certain death, and so forth and so on, and he gets King David to swear to him that he won't touch him. And when David HaMelech died, he says to King Solomon, I was not allowed to do that. He has to be punished. And of course you can't punish him for no reason, so you have to help him find a reason so that you can give him what's coming to him. That's what the Navi says, how the Navi describes the story. But in the scheme of this episode, there's an odd passage, a very, very odd passage. In the middle of this scheme, in the middle of this story, there's a pasuk. It says the following words. This is a direct quote. Ki Hashem amar lekaleo. God told Shimi to curse David. That's the pasuk says. Ki Hashem amar lekaleo. God told Shimi to curse David. In other words, when David is contemplating being nice and forgiving him, one of the arguments goes, the curse is coming from God and not from Shimi. So Alter Rebbe quotes that pasuk and says, what does that mean? Shimi ben Gera wasn't just anybody. He was from the heads of the Sanhedrin. He was an incredible scholar, certainly fully aware of what he was doing. In other words, arguably, if anybody knew what it means to exercise free will, it was him. And he made a terrible judgment. In other words, he gambled. He was thinking David was going to lose. It was very important for him to firmly establish himself in the opposition. What does it mean, Hashem Amalek Aleil? And the answer is the curse that came from Shimei ben Geder to King David came from God. Shimei ben Geder is going to have to pay for it because he made a bad judgment and he exercised bad choice. But at the same time, when David HaMelech is at the receiving end of those klolos, of those curses coming from God. And therefore, when somebody gets angry, what is the core or the cause of that anger? The lack of belief that it's coming from God. And this lack of belief that it's coming from God is in a subtle way, in an abstract way, in a theoretical way, the equivalent of idol worship. Like I explained to you before, idolatry doesn't mean there's no God or that you worship the tooth fairy. Idolatry means that there is a God. And Azav Hashem es his relationship with the earth is indirect, it's at arm's distance, and consequently there is space for beings, entities, other than he, to assert themselves, namely this person who has particularly dissed me, hurt me personally, and so forth and so on. So Alter Rebbe gives this clarification of the teaching of the Baal Shem Tov, and he goes into this very complicated mystical thesis, which we're going to do next week, perhaps over the next several weeks. But for tonight, we're going to skip all of that. I'm not going to delve into all of the mysticism. And it does get quite involved. And I'm hoping, and of course, with the help of God, I trust, I'll be able to get it across the complexity of the issue. And it's not only complicated, but it is actually controversial. In other words, it's in our best interest to understand both points of view, notwithstanding that we're a Hasidic gathering, so of course, the Alter Rebbe is right, and, quote, they're wrong. It's important for us to understand their perspective, to understand the Alter Rebbe's perspective, to appreciate how sensitive and how critical the issues were, and then to sort of zero in on what the Alter Rebbe is saying. But he goes into this most involved mystical rendition that says God is in everything, including in evil. Now, God's presence in evil is very complicated. It includes such exalted inaccessibilities as makif and achirayim and golus, all kinds of words that argue that his involvement is not so, quote, revealed. But in the final analysis, the position that Chassidus takes, and as I told you before, the Alter Rebbe says, the Arizal says this, in the end, if God were not an evil, evil would not be. And as a result, it makes no difference from where the evil comes, from a Jew, from a Gentile, inside Israel, outside of Israel, in the physical world, in the spiritual world, there's God there. And therefore, in as much as the recipient of the negative is concerned, you have to view it as coming through the Nitya Tzilaki, the divine spark, which allows this being to exist, to affect whatever ill is coming to you. That's his argument. And he goes into a discussion about anger, which is interesting. Just a couple of little details. Is anger ever justified? And if yes, when? And of course the answer is anger is justified when it's constructive, when it's useful. And of course Rambam writes this. It's never good to feel angry, but on occasion you must act angry. And Rambam spells it out very, very clearly. If you cannot act angry without feeling angry, then you shouldn't act angry. But there are occasions where a person, in the Yiddish, you would say, darf sich bezerin, must put on a face of disappointment, of frustration, but never feel it. In what case would anger be justified? And of course the answer is in case where the anger would serve a purpose. For example, la'afrushim yisur, if someone is doing something wrong, like talking in shul, God forbid, which of course none of us have ever met anybody who talks in shul, because we daven in those shuls where nobody talks. But yene, the other shuls, and one of us is very frustrated by their not talking in shul. The justification for acting angry would be if it would serve the purpose of quieting people. When, however, it doesn't serve that purpose, doesn't matter why. So then you have to look at the anger from a different perspective. And allow me an indulgence. I'm going to tell you something which the Rebbe writes in his talks that is a theological loop. It's something that's so hard to piece together. But the Rebbe brings, obviously from the earlier teachers of Hasidus, from the previous Rabbi, a rule that says we don't have free will, period. In other words, the job we took, the home we chose, the car we drive, the clothing we didn't choose those things. God chose those things because we are, forgive my cynicism perhaps, we're puppets. He governs our lives in a subliminal way, in such a way that we don't feel his influence. We're not exercising free will, except when it comes to matters of Torah mitzvahs. When it comes to issues of Yiddishkeit, in other words, mitzvahs and sins, directly, God steps back and gives us free will. But when it comes to parochial issues, to irreligious issues, we feel like we have free will, but we don't really have free will. Now, of course, that opens up a huge Pandora's box to like, what do you mean? How does free will work? And just, you're going to have to trust me because I'm not intent on exploring it, that there is a whole theology that underlies this position, that underlies this argument. But be that as it may, this is the position that I believe this letter takes. That when it comes to ordinary things, we're not really choosing. When it comes to matters of Yiddishkeit, we are. So, if someone is doing something wrong vis-a-vis Yiddishkeit, where we can presume that they're exercising free will, if your anger will help them stop, your anger becomes justified. And acting angry, as explained before, as opposed to being angry, is useful in correcting that person. However, when it comes to things that don't involve Yiddishkeit directly, where that person, if you would truly get into the heart of the matter theologically, doesn't have free will, so then you have to look at it differently. How should you look at it? You should look at it like any time you find yourself in a situation where you're helpless. In other words, even if it's a religious matter, but you can't help it. And he brings an example which we had earlier in the Tanya, chapter 28, of you're in the middle of praying, and some pain in the neck decides to bother you. And not he's bothering you because he wants your attention, so you should buy stocks and bonds or give him an adova. He decides to bother you for the simple purpose of disturbing you. He doesn't like the fact that you're davening. He wants to see the degree of your resolve, and he just harasses you. How do you deal with somebody who bothers you just for the sake of bothering you? And one thing you don't do is negotiate with them, have conversations with them, because that's exactly what they want. You ignore them. Now, ignoring someone standing over your head as you daven and screaming requires virtually superhuman effort and self-control. But that's the truth of the matter. When something happens in your life where your anger is not serving a practical purpose, in other words, where you cannot act angry to help a situation, you have to change your attitude towards that event and say, this is God's test to me. It has nothing to do with that person. Nothing to do with their psychological, emotional, religious, spiritual, social issues. It's about me. You know, there was a chassid by the name of Nissen Nemenav. He was a special chassid, extraordinary chassid. I don't know if there was another person after the Holocaust like him. He was what Chabad Hasidim used to call the old Neza Ovid. Which meant to say, his whole life, literally every breath and every thought, was defined by am I or am I not serving God with this action. I don't remember him, but people say he would sit and hold a piece of bread and mentally ask himself if he needed to eat it. You know, when he ate, his face would be tomato red because there was a concentration that was going on. Someone described it to me. Whenever he ate, he would just become red. Again, I never met this person. And his whole life was incredibly intense, unbelievably intense, and every action of him was measured. Okay, listen, when he davened, there was no world, you know. And every day, davening was a war. Davening took hours, not once a week or once a month. Every day, davening was an engagement with him and God. It took forever. So there was a chassid, a young Lubavitcher, who decided to put the Tanya to the test at Reb Nissen's expense. The Tanya says that what are you supposed to do if someone bothers you just for the sake of bothering you? Ignore him. So he went into 7-7. It's a true story. It's printed not in Nissan's biography, it's in Reuven Dunham's biography, the person who did it. And he stood next to him and just bothered him. He wanted to see if he could make him lose his cool, if he could stop him from davening. And he tried hard. And I can assure you, if you knew this person, he was very, very good at getting under people's skin. And he couldn't. At first he ignored him, then he put his fingers, he just kept right on going. And he saw a living model of what the Tanya says. That when you find yourself in a situation where there is a test, that you cannot help, you have to view it as the noise is coming directly from God, not from this zlob, from this nudnik, who's harassing you because he wants to be entertained. And if it's coming directly from God, it's a test. And what's the point of a test? Like we're learning in the Pashas of last week and this week about Avraham Avinu, to make you a better person. Like he brings the Lashon HaPasuk, Asher shalat ha'adam ba'adam l'ra loy. And we're going to be talking about this over the next couple of weeks. That the way God created his world is that there's good and evil. And it happens on occasion that God seems to give dominance to evil over good. Shalat ha'adam del yumazeh. Al ha'adam del kedusha. That the evil form seems to be dominant over the positive form. L'ra loy. And doesn't know that the end of it is going to be that the evil is going to be defeated. In other words, the purpose for giving power to not positive forces is to conquer them and to ultimately transform them and so forth and so on. So when someone's angry, someone is being angered, and it's not in a situation where there is a free will involved, and consequently the anger serves a purpose, the response has to be, it's coming from God, it's a test from God, God is trying to make you better, take it. And of course, Alter Rebbe says, that's kind of difficult to do. It's very, very difficult to do. So he suggests contemplating the concept of Galus HaShechina, contemplating the idea, the Kabbalistic idea, which we will be talking about in subsequent weeks, that down here in these worlds, God himself is in a considerable state of camouflage. And part of that camouflage is masking himself in what amounts to not good, evil. And God himself allows himself to be masked in these kinds of evil, in what's called in the Kabbalah world, in a form of galus, in a form of exile, because of the redemptive quality that's going to come as a result. And the Alter Rebbe makes the ultimate point. And again, I'm just giving you, so to speak, the skin and bones. I'm giving you just the very, 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 very beginning and end of this letter. I'm skipping all the philosophy, I'm skipping all the mysticism. I intend on doing it in the subsequent weeks. I don't know yet if this is going to take 1 week or 2 more weeks, but we're not going to rush, which is of course the good news about this year's cycle, that we're able to spend as much time as we need. And the essence of the argument is, in evil there's a presence of God. Perhaps it's not a revealed presence of God, but there's a presence of God. And it is that the presence of God and evil which says, in effect, these challenges are coming directly from God. And he finishes the letter by making the same point I made to you earlier. He says, these theological positions are based squarely on the teachings of the Arizal. And he quotes them. So the Arizal says this, the Arizal says this, the Arizal says this. This is the source of these ideas. You object, please direct your criticism to the correct address. These are not Hasidic original thoughts, although of course Hasidus has disseminated these ideas and made them not just mystical and philosophical, but theological and practical. But you got the wrong address to criticize Hasidus and say that Hasidus is outside the pale of Judaism with these beliefs. Excuse me, these are not our original beliefs. The origins of the Baal Shem Tov. And then he says something else. And just for the record, Alter Rebbe says, the Jewish nation is thousands of years old. And these ideas, that everything that happens comes from God, even when it involves man's free will, Jews have always known the emunah pshuta. Jews just took it for granted. On simple faith. Jews never really even delved into the theological complexities and the theological nuance, the theological controversies of the question. They simply knew, as a matter of fact, he quotes the Lashon HaPasuk, I fill heaven and earth. In other words, God is everything and everywhere. If something happened to me, even if it involved the free will of another person, be they Jew or Gentile, it's coming to me directly from God. He says, only recently that people began, and I'm using my own words now, people began to define their faith based on their theology. In other words, rather than believe plain, you can study philosophy all you want, study theology all you want, but when you live your life as a religious person, you have what's called in the Paltiel a mina pshita, simple faith. He says we've achieved a new, I guess call it low, where people are exploring theology. And not only exploring theology as a philosophy, but exploring theology and then defining what they believe on that basis. This is a new analysis. This is a new thought process. Not that the ideas are new, but the idea that based on these thought processes, people are determining what they do and don't believe. This is all brand new. For much of our history, even the great theologians, when it came to faith, they believed these truths, if you will, as self-evident, without needing to corroborate them. Everybody believed that God's in charge of his world. The idea that perhaps because of the issues of evil and klipa and how can godliness be involved in evil, which is of course the underpinnings of this question, are all new. And the Alter Rebbe says, consequently, these are my arguments. Number one, I've just explained it to you. Number two, don't direct the criticism at Hasidus. The criticism belongs to the Arizal. And number three, the very fact that you're engaging in this is a symptom of an enlightenment, is a symptom of a new ageism, if you will. Because not like the issues are right or wrong, they're certainly correct, but Jews never thought about them theologically. They just accepted, as a matter of fact, that these things were true, and that's what Jewish people always believed. So this is the beginning of a letter and the end of a letter. And this is the easy class. And like I told you in the beginning, the Alter Rebbe then felt obligated to defend Hasidus. Hasidus was the new kid on the block. Hasidus was the new movement. Hasidus had the radical ideas. Hasidus felt then that it must explain itself. Alter Rebbe traveled. He met Gedolei HaMisnagdim of all types, all different communities, because he felt that it was the obligation lay with him to do what he could to redeem, to alleviate the pressure and the divisions that were forming because of the development of Hasidus. And it's in that spirit that this letter was written.